We must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. This family knows what to do, just as your own family should. They know that even a thin cloth helps protect them. Even a newspaper can save you from a bad burn. But the most important thing of all is to duck and cover yourself, especially where your clothes do not cover you.
Remember what to do, friends. Now tell me right out loud. What are you supposed to do when you see the flash? Duck and cover. Duck and cover. Duck.
This is Lecture 8B, pages 982 to 987 of your textbook. All right, the Cold War essentially divided the world into 4 different camps or sides. First world countries were those nations that were industrialized and capitalist, including the United States and her allies in NATO. Second world nations were those countries that had aligned themselves with the Soviet Union, were communist, and were most often part of the Warsaw Pact alliance. All remaining world nations were part of what became known as the Third World and included countries that were still developing or were newly independent and hadn't aligned themselves with the U.S. or Soviets yet. And finally, there was actually a fourth camp, and these included non-aligned nations who didn't wish to pick sides in our fight. These nations included China, Yugoslavia, and India, as well as Indonesia, amongst others. These non-aligned nations met at a conference in Indonesia in 1955 called the Bandung Conference to declare themselves a third force, or non-aligned. A list of Cold War strategies used by both the Soviet Union and the USA during the Cold War include, so write these down, this is super important. First, foreign aid. Second, they used propaganda. They also used espionage, or spying. Fourth, brinkmanship, which I discussed in my last lecture. 5, multinational alliances, also discussed in my last lecture. And finally, 6, surrogate or substitute wars. Soon, many third world nations became battlegrounds for proxy wars or war by proxy. This simply means that they were places where Cold War showdowns often occurred. The U.S. and Soviet Union never fought each other directly. Instead, we fought proxy wars in surrogate or substitute nations like Korea and Vietnam. In many third world nations, we used a variety of strategies to attempt to persuade them to support us. The Soviet Union did the same thing. These strategies included helping the people of these nations to fight against their own governments by supplying rebel groups with guns, weapons, military training, and money to help them overthrow regimes who perhaps didn't share our point of view. The Soviets did the same thing. Essentially, both the Soviet Union and the U.S. helped other nations conduct civil wars or guerrilla warfare. We also spied on one another during the Cold War. The CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency in the U.S., as well as the KGB in the Soviet Union, engaged in a number of secretive activities to gather intelligence about the other nations. Both nations also sent humanitarian aid to third world countries in an attempt to persuade them to take sides in the Cold War. Many of the third world nations where Cold War proxy conflicts occurred were located in Latin America. Many of these nations had faced years and years of political and economic instability following their independence from Spain, Portugal, and other European powers in the 1800s. Many of these nations had dictators. A great example of this is Cuba. During the 1950s, Cuba was ruled by a dictator named Batista. He was supported by the United States, and the U.S. was heavily invested in Cuba, especially its tourist industry. Lots of American companies were making money off the island because of Batista's relationship with the U.S. The people who wasn't really benefiting from this? Well, the people of Cuba. In 1959, a communist revolutionary named Fidel Castro led a revolution against Batista and overthrew him. Castro established a command or communist economy, and he ruled as a communist totalitarian dictator. He nationalized all businesses, and he kicked out U.S. businesses. The U.S. immediately halted all trade with Cuba, which is called an embargo. This really hurt the Cuban economy. So who did they naturally turn to or turn towards for help? Why, the Soviet Union, of course. The USSR provided Cuba with military and economic aid. The U.S. tried to overthrow Castro in 1960 by training Cuban exiles, or Cuban people who had moved to the U.S., for a military invasion at the Bay of Pigs. Unfortunately, the attempt was a disaster, and the exiled soldiers were slaughtered by Castro's forces on the beach. Cuba eventually became a hotspot for the Cold War in 1962, when then premier or leader for the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, built 42 missile sites in Cuba and armed these sites with nuclear missiles that were pointed at targets or cities in the U.S. Located only 90 miles from the United States, a nuclear attack by the Soviets from Cuba would have been devastating and would have destroyed us before we could fire back. In what became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, JFK blockaded Soviet submarines and ships, preventing them from delivering more missiles to Cuba. Over a 13-day period in October, it appeared that the U.S. would have a nuclear war with the Soviets. Fortunately, to say the least, Khrushchev ordered the missiles removed from Cuba. However, Cuba still played a huge role in the Cold War. Castro ended up backing many other communist revolutions throughout Latin America. As of 2014, Fidel Castro has been gravely ill for several years. Power is currently held by Castro's brother, Raul. They face many challenges now that the Cold War is over, especially economic ones. Other Cold War proxy wars and conflicts in Latin America included the U.S. taking sides in a civil war in Nicaragua in the late 1970s. Bottom line, we had been supporting a pretty horrible dictatorship there under the Anastasio Somoza and oligarchic Somoza family since the 1930s. Communist Sandinista rebels, under the leadership of a rebel named Daniel Ortega and supported by Soviet aid, toppled the dictatorship. The U.S. responded by providing weapons and money to another rebel group called the Contras. The Civil War lasted until 1990, when free elections were held, and a democratically elected president named Violeta Chamorro was elected. Democratically elected leaders were also chosen in the 1996 and 2001 elections. Other Cold War proxy wars included those in Asian nations like Korea and Vietnam. Shortly after World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel into two zones of occupation, and it gradually developed into two nations. North Korea became communist and was aided by the Soviet Union. South Korea was aided by the United States and was democratic. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The United Nations Security Council voted to respond to this invasion using force, and it should be noted that the Soviets were absent from this vote. UN forces led by American General Douglas MacArthur initially were able to push troops back into North Korea towards China. The Chinese responded by sending massive numbers of their troops to assist the North Koreans. These troops outnumbered the UN troops and quickly pushed UN troops beyond the 38th parallel back into South Korea. In a nutshell, MacArthur proposed using up to 30 atomic bombs against the Chinese. President Truman told MacArthur this was reckless, and no. MacArthur went over his boss's head and tried to persuade Congress and the media that we needed to bomb China. Truman promptly removed MacArthur from power. In 1953, the Korean War ended almost exactly where it had started, with two separate nations divided along the 38th parallel at a cost of 4 million military and civilian deaths. North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung took over and ruled North Korea from 1953 to 1994 as a communist totalitarian dictator, and he embraced a philosophy called Juche, or self-reliance. Unfortunately, North Korea continues to suffer due to these policies and has isolated itself from world politics today. Following Kim Il-sung, his son, Kim Jong-il, took over in 1994 and ruled until his death in 2011. Kim Jong-il's son, Kim Jong-un, is the current totalitarian leader of a still communist North Korea. The Vietnam War was another proxy war during the Cold War period. Following civil wars in French territory called Indochina, the French were forced to grant independence to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The communist Viet Minh, or rebel forces who were fighting the French and led by a man named Ho Chi Minh, fought for independence. With the defeat of the French by Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh rebels, the U.S. was afraid the whole region would fall to communism in what later became known as the domino theory effect. The domino theory was basically a fear the U.S. had about the region, that if one Asian nation fell to communism, all the others would fall like dominoes shortly thereafter. Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam was communist, led by Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam was democratic and led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Communist guerrillas, called the Viet Cong, eventually attacked South Vietnam in order to make it part of North Vietnam. The U.S. fought the Vietnam War from 1965 to 1973. It included massive bombing campaigns against the Viet Cong and attempted Vietnamization of South Vietnam, which was President Nixon's attempt to gradually remove troops and provide military support to the South Vietnamese so they could take back their country. This failed. 1.5 million Vietnamese and 56,000 Americans lost their lives in the conflict. Vietnam became a communist nation and remains so today, although they've introduced a number of market and political reforms in recent years. The effects of the Vietnam War on other nations were widespread, including those nations that bordered Vietnam, like Cambodia and Laos. These nations became embroiled in the conflict when Viet Cong soldiers hid over their borders. The Americans had secret bombing missions in Laos as well as Cambodia that killed many civilians, but very few Viet Cong forces. Additionally, Cambodia had a civil war in the early 1970s that ended in 1975 with the communist takeover of the country by a communist rebel group called the Khmer Rouge. This group orchestrated a massive genocide of 800,000 Cambodians from 1975 to 1979 as they attempted to recreate the earlier Khmer kingdom from thousands of years before using communism. Under the leadership of Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge was eventually attacked by the Vietnamese in 1978, fighting a subsequent war with them, and then the Vietnamese controlled Cambodia until around 1989. The Vietnamese withdrew in 1989, and free elections were finally held in 1993. Pol Pot was never held accountable for his crimes with the Khmer Rouge. He was allowed to live under house arrest until 1998, at which point he commits suicide. Vietnam and Cambodia are still considered developing nations today. Thanks for listening.